Hi everybody, I hope you're having a great day. If you watched our video this past weekend where we unboxed the PlayStation Classic, I said I was going to come back a little bit later in the week when we had some more time to play around with it, talk a little bit more in depth about my experience with it, what I think about the situation, and am I happy with my purchase. And overall, I think the two main points that I want to start off with are, one, I am happy with my purchase. I'm actually glad I got it. And two, in the same token, I am completely understanding why a lot of people are dissatisfied and canceled their pre-orders and don't want it. I completely understand that perspective entirely. I think it really is something even more so than any of the Nintendo Minis, any more so than their classic kind of plug-and-play things. I think the way Sony really underperformed with the PS1 Classic shows that there's not as much to go on as far as wanting the PS1. I think it's really more dependent upon what you want in particular versus with the NES Mini and the Super Nintendo, the SNES Mini. I think that there's a greater variety of people that would find something useful in that and desire those products because they are overall, or were handled better than the PlayStation Classic. And part of that is entirely the fault of Sony, and part of that is also expectations. And I think that for me, I'm happy with the purchase because of the reasons why I wanted it, and because it met my expectations. And I think a lot of people were dissatisfied once the whole thing was revealed and all the details, because one, it either didn't meet their expectations, or what they wanted out of this console, this little plug-and-play thing, is different than what I wanted out of it. And I think it really depends on who you are and what you want out of this thing, whether or not it met those expectations. I think some people who are talking about, going into first a little bit about why I think no matter what, this wasn't going to be what some people wanted, and then on the other side, then I'll talk about how Sony also messed up. So it's not no consumer blaming type thing. I'm not defending Sony in any way. Sony messed up, but at the same time, it is more of also, what did you want out of this thing? There's no way it was going to be that. Some people are saying that, like, why would I want this if I can just get, Raspberry Pi and put out, tons more games on it, or I can do something else with an emulator on my computer. And I feel like if you are looking at this, before it came out, before everything was announced, as something that's going to be a competition for that and replace that, there was no way this was ever going to be that. There's even if Sony did put more effort into this, I foresaw no way in which they would put enough thought and effort into this to make this compete with that type of emulation and that type of individual. And I feel like that type of person who is already doing that, or is planning on doing that, or is very much into emulation and that type of thing, is not the target audience for this at all. So I don't understand why some people with that perspective were disappointed, because this was never going to be something to replace that. This was never going to be for that target audience to begin with. And then you also have the issue of the game list. And a lot of people pre-ordered this when it was first announced. You just had this handful of games. And then when the entire game list came out, they canceled their pre-orders. A lot of people did that. And I was the opposite. I did not pre-order it when it first was announced because they didn't show all the games, and I wasn't going to pre-order it if I didn't know what the heck was on this thing. I'm not going to pre-order it unless I know what the product is. I pre-ordered it once the games were all announced, because then I was like, okay, I know what it is. Is it worth the money to me? And I'll get to why I think it is, just for what I wanted out of it. To me, it was, and I got it. And I think a lot of people that were disappointed, just talking about comments that I saw and people that I've talked to in person and people that were kind of interested, and even people that I know that were interested and then disinterested when the games came out, there are two fronts to it. One, Sony, I will admit, someone who was a happy owner of this thing, it is just not as good as it could have been, both in the way the games were handled and what games are on here. The games list could have been better, Sony could have done more. But no matter what Sony did, even if Sony put more effort into this than Nintendo did with their mini, their classic consoles, it still would have not have met expectations, because I don't think it would be possible, it would be feasible with something like this, because this is a system where there are thousands of games, hundreds upon hundreds of bestsellers, and everyone's experience was so varied. No list of 20 games, no list of even 30 or 40 games would appease everyone. It would be impossible. But again, it still could have been better what they did. Just looking at, talking to people in comments, people are constantly saying, like, it's not a PlayStation Classic without this game, this game, and this game. And just to show how different people's experiences can be, those, comment right underneath them would say entirely different games. Sometimes people would say, list 5 games and say, there's no such thing as a PlayStation Classic without these 5 games. And I'd be like, I've never played any of those 5 games, and I've played several hundred PS1 games, one of my favorite systems. That just shows how different people's experiences are for those systems. Some people would say, I want this game, this game, this game, this game, not list a single RPG, because they don't play RPGs, and there are a lot of people like that. But for the PS1, it's fast to have a little bit of every genre, and the RPG, that was really one of the staples of the original PlayStation, was the RPG genre, and really how it helped really push that genre in North America. Outside of Japan, it really helped push that genre in general. And then you have people who would just list 19 RPGs and maybe one other random game, and that doesn't appeal to everyone either, because a lot of people, again, don't play RPGs. People wanting WCW wrestling games on it. There's just no way to meet everyone's expectation. There's no way, even if Sony did a better job, this would have been seen as lackluster by most people, because there's no way it could cover everyone's desires for this console. And then you also have a lot of cases, more than I expected, of people just not quite comprehending licensing issues. It's really weird to me, where the original Tony Hawk or Pro Skater or Pro Skater 2, that would have been great on here. And there's a couple other examples of games that would have been amazing, but they would have been a licensing nightmare with all of the music. And some other titles for other various reasons, as far as using likeness of individuals and things like that, where it would have been a nightmare, and I wasn't expecting them on here at all. And I think that was the other thing with expectations. Some people were expecting titles on here that couldn't have been on here, or logically wouldn't have been. And then other titles where people would say there's no excuse that this game or this game has been released in the past 6 months in another collection, or it already has or is getting an HD remaster. There's no reason that it shouldn't be on here. Things like Crash and Spyro. But it is, because a lot of those, particularly getting into certain other ones that have no association, no ownership whatsoever by Sony, those products, are under the ownership of someone else. And Sony, more than Nintendo was for their systems, Sony's more dependent upon third-party publishers and getting the rights to actually put it on here and getting affordable rights. And it does make sense that a lot of companies would not want something they just released in another collection they're trying to make money off of. They wouldn't want to possibly eat into those sales by releasing it on here. And there also would have been issues too, where I think a lot of the games made it on here for this because Sony did cheap out on the effort and the money to get rights to some things that they still might have been able to from third-party publishers. So I think there is also, again, there's so many games here that couldn't have been on here, so many games that logistically wouldn't make sense, and no list of 20 would appease everyone. It'd be impossible. But I keep saying too, it could have been better though, because Sony did cheap out even more so than Nintendo did. So it's not defending Sony. It's saying that there's no way this could ever have appealed to everyone. There's no way it could have met everyone's expectations. It would have been impossible. But at the same time, it still could have been a little better than it was. And then you also, talking a bit here about the games at the end. I'll go over those at the very end individually, why I think it's still a decent list. More about the performance, though. Now that I've had the chance to actually play through, I'm recording this Wednesday afternoon. We got this Saturday early afternoon. Played a little bit each day. Played some two-player with Amanda on the weekend. And overall, I'm not disappointed in the performance. Again, it could have been better, but as far as the 50 hertz versus 60 hertz issue with having PAL emulated copies on here, the only time where I really noticed it was playing Tekken 3. And I say that because even with the other, either the other PAL versions of games, no matter what, every game that I want that is on this PS1, I own actual physical copies, and every single one of them doesn't look quite as good or perform quite as well in this package or in any emulation form on an HD TV as it does with the actual physical copy on a quality CRT on my PS1 or PS2. So no matter what, any little performance differences or issue with this, didn't bother me because that's what I expected. I expected it to be not quite perfect, and it is not quite perfect. Tekken, again, the timing threw me off a little bit, but I'm not going to be playing competitive Tekken on the PS1 Mini. I have 2 copies of it already on the PlayStation, the Bleemcast disc, so I can play it on the Dreamcast. You know, it comes as a bonus for in Tekken 5. Like, it's just cool to have it on there because it's an essential game. And then so yeah, it's not perfect system in any way. It could have been better on Sony's part, but at the same time, it also was never going to meet people's expectations. And it met my expectations because this is what I expected it to be. I didn't expect this to be the perfect emulation box for the original PlayStation. I didn't expect this to be the perfect legacy box to have the absolute cream of the crop of the system and have like 50, 60 games on it. I never expected any of that. I expected this to be exactly what it is. And Nintendo did handle theirs a little bit better, but at the same time, they were the same thing. They were also still just a cash grab for the holiday season, trying to fill the void between the Wii U kind of dying out and the Nintendo Switch ramping up and being eventually released. That's what they were, a little stopgap measure, and that's what this is. Fill the holiday season just with something here and just put it together and have some good stuff and some mediocre stuff, but put the package together as quickly and cheaply as possible where it's still functional and half decent. That was Sony's goal. That's what I expected them to do, and that's what they did. And as far as why I'm happy and why I'm glad to own it, again, because it met those expectations. It wasn't disappointing because my expectations to begin with weren't sky high. I really wasn't expecting extraordinary things. And I own this. I wanted this for the same reason that I own this. This, Shenron here, plug and play game, because this is just a more extreme version of this. That's what it is. That's what I expected it to be, and that's why I'm not disappointed, because that's what it is. I grew up with DBZ, it helped introduce me to anime. I love it. Found this for, like $5-6 or whatever at a thrift store. You can plug it in and play a couple of DBZ themed mini games on it, and have it on the shelf then, and just kind of is cool little collectible thing here because I like DBZ. Same thing here. I love the original PlayStation. That's a system that pulled me away from my PC and made me a console gamer forever. I absolutely love this system. Some of my favorite games of all time are on here. So I wanted a cute, adorable little plug-and-play PS1 with some games to play. And whether or not it was worth the price depended on what was on there. This was just this, and it came with, say, like 2 or 3 games on it, and that was it. I still would have paid like $20-30 for it. It would have been cool. It would have been worth it, and it doesn't replace some actual physical copies in any way. It's just kind of cool to have hooked up in the other room, away from where the PS1, PS2 actually are, in the office space on the HD TV in there. Just have it hooked up in the corner there, and it's just kind of a fun little collectible thing. Again, I own this for the same reasons I own this. And as far as the $100 price tag, what it came down to was there are 20 games on here, and some of them are better than others. Some of them are odd choices. The original, Persona with a weird, North American English translation of the original Persona, the Revelations version. It should have been The Legend of Dragoon, and like some other choices with the same situation where it was kind of oddball ones. But overall, there are 20 games on here. Most of them are games that I do enjoy, and especially considering the number of RPGs on here, you have several hundred hours worth of content on here. So even though it's not a replacement for those original copies, am I going to go replay Final Fantasy VII eventually on here just for the hell of it? Even though I've played it countless times over and over the years? Yeah, probably, just for fun. I'll revisit a couple games on here just to have it constantly just kind of hooked up there on TV, plug and play some, Twisted Metal or something with Amanda, that kind of thing, some Rayman. Yeah, it's just kind of a cool collector's thing to have. That's why I have it. And then, again, we're going to talk about now individually what I think about each one of the games and why I think it is not a perfect list, could never have been, but is better than a lot of people are giving it credit for. Alright, so here we have the main menu of the PlayStation Classic. A little bit of glare there from the window. Hopefully I can get rid of that, maybe not. Yeah, first things first, I heard some people complain about the menu system in general, and I don't have any problem with it. Yeah, everyone says, oh, it looks bare bones. Again, expectations, it's a cheap plug and play. I don't know why you need a fancy menu to begin with. You're just selecting games. I care about the games. I don't care about it. Could have been a bullet point with their names with no cover picture for all I care about. Yeah, but it looks fine. Anyway, Battle Arena Toshinden. This is one of those ones that I heard a lot of people say, why is this here? And I guess either weren't around or weren't really into fighting games at the time, because I remember this being a huge deal when this first came out. The series in general, I don't think after this first one really evolved very well. I played Battle Royale Toshinden 1, 2, 3, and a couple of spin-off things here, and it went on for a while, but again, I feel like it's one that slowly slipped away into irrelevance after the first one. A decent series, but even the first one has its flaws. But when it came out, I remember being blown away with not only the 3D character models, but the amount of freedom of movement and the smoothness of the movement around the arena was fairly unique at the time. There were very few games that really came close to that. It was even an improvement in many ways over even like the Virtua Fighter, as far as having freedom of movement in a 3D fighter. Not as good of a game overall, but it was still fun, and it was one of the earlier 3D fighters that involved weapons also, before even Soul Edge and things like that. And again, that would be surpassed very quickly. The series went into irrelevancy pretty quickly, but this game I remember being a huge deal when it first came out, and everyone being very excited for it, and it was one of the first games I ever got for the system. So I actually have a bit of a history of this game. It's the first game that I played on the original PlayStation. I own the long box version and the jewel case edition of this, and then years later, Battle Arena Toshinden Remix was the first game I ever played on the Sega Saturn. So I have definitely a storied history with this game, and it definitely deserves a spot here in my opinion. Cool Borders, this is one of the very few franchises that I thought was going to be on here as far as having a sports game, because it didn't rely heavily on a lot of music track licensing or a ton of likeness licensing, and there weren't as many hurdles to getting on here, and it's definitely one that I thought was going to be cheap to get on the system and have rights held by Sony and things like that. I definitely thought it was going to be a Cool Borders on here. Cool Borders 2 is not my favorite in the series, but I think it's still a solid entry. I really like, I think maybe 4 might be my favorite, I don't know overall, but still a good one that really shows off what games like that were like at the time, before you had an even more arcadey, over-the-top feel with Tony Hawk, and then going SSX and SSX Tricky for snowboarding. A good one there. Destruction Derby, not one I played much back in the day. I only knew 1 or 2 people that owned this, but yeah, this is one of those oddball ones that I was kind of like, alright, but it is Sony Interactive Entertainment, so earned a spot just for being, again, cheap plug and play. This was an easy one to kind of to shoehorn in. One I could have done without, but moving on then here to Final Fantasy VII. In my opinion, this had to be included here. I mean, even if you are not a fan of RPGs, this was so important, not just to RPGs, and this is important to RPGs in general outside of Japan. And it's one of those games where its legacy is even more important than the actual game itself. What it really did for the genre in the Final Fantasy series also during that time period, and I think it ushered in one of my favorite eras for a company that I think has really fallen from grace. Square in the 90s was incredible, did amazing games, of course, on the NES and then on the Super Nintendo, but here for me is where they really hit their prime with so many amazing games every year, and they are what they are today. But yeah, this is like one of the ultimate classics, and this is one of my top 10 games ever, so having this on here is just a must, so I'm very happy that's on here. The original Grand Theft Auto, this is one that I had not played more than like 10 minutes before. I'm not a fan of the series. I actually don't play many Rockstar games to begin with, at all. I'm not really into the Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Revolver and Red Dead Redemption series, any of those. Not my thing, but it was cool to have this here because it really showed where that would eventually go, and I like how it was, it was a big hit at the time, very different, but really showed how the Grand Theft Auto series evolved, and I think this was a cool one to have here, because I think many people, particularly today, started more with Grand Theft Auto 3 or Vice City or San Andreas and that kind of stuff, so it's cool to have this on here and let people see how different it was, but at the same time you can really see all the seeds of what it would become, starting with the PlayStation 2. Intelligent Cube. This, I think, is a very underrated puzzle game. Again, I'm not a huge fan of puzzle games, if you know me and watch my channel, but this is one that is quirky and interesting enough that I feel like it's cool to have on here. Speaking of quirky, Jumping Flash, This was a great, very early title for the original PlayStation, and something that I think is really cool to have on here because it's getting harder and harder to find a physical copy. I've not seen a physical copy since the days of the PS1, as far as, in any sort of retail store, used game stores, things like that. So I feel like it's cool to have something like that on here that's also very, very creative and really shows an interesting take on the 3D platformer in a way, and a very different take than something, say, like a Mario or a Spyro, something very, very different and creative. Another essential one like Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, this had to be on here. I'm happy that's on there. Mr. Driller, I know I saw a bunch of comments of people like, why the heck does that deserve a spot? Mr. Driller is amazing. Mr. Driller, it was a huge hit in the arcades and has been a long ongoing series. Spin-off of Dig Dug, his daddy. Mr. Driller is amazing. It's it's been one of my favorite puzzle games forever. It's just a heck of a lot of fun, and I'm very glad that it's on here. Same thing with Oddworld Abe's Odyssey. The first two Oddworld games on PS1 were very interesting and creative, and I think very important to showcase some very fascinating gaming on the console, so definitely an important one there. Rayman, a little bit mixed on this one. I like the original Rayman, and it was greatest hits in most regions. I feel on the PS1 is really cool. I would love to see Rayman show up. I'd love to see, this is never going to happen, but an Atari Jaguar Mini, that would be really cool, because Rayman's one of those titles that it started off on the Atari Jaguar, and now though it's like a loose cart is like $100, so well, I'm never going to grab that. That would be really cool though to see, but having it on here is still interesting because it's a very colorful side-scrolling platformer, and again helps flesh out what the 20 games are. So you'll see there's like one or two on just about every genre, because it really needs to cover everything. That's part of the strength of what's on here, but also its weakness is that no individual library really can be shown on the original PlayStation in its entirety. Like, you can't have all of the amazing RPGs, you can't have all the great fighting games, you can't have all the amazing survival horror games. There's no genre on here that can really be fully represented in just 20 games. So yeah, this is just it's cool to have this because of representing that genre, and because things like Crash and Spyro I was not expecting to be on here when it first came out, just because of the recent remasters, and then they weren't. Resident Evil Director's Cut, I'm happy that's on here. I prefer Resident Evil 2, but as far as thinking about the legacy of the original PlayStation in that term, I actually think this is a better choice in that context. This is probably the weirdest one for me, Revelations Persona. Just why? This is actually the first Shin Megami Tensei game, well, not technically, but in North America it gets the moniker Shin Megami Tensei for the spin-off Persona series. First one I ever played, and I only kind of liked it when I first played in the original PlayStation. It actually wasn't until I played Persona 2 Eternal Punishment in North America on the PlayStation that I got into the Persona series, really. And this one, there are some interesting things about it, but once you have the PSP version of it over here, it's infinitely superior to this bizarre kind of butchered version with the one character basically in blackface, and then you have the very, very interesting translations in the script. It's an odd choice, and this one, it leads me to believe that maybe there's going to be a second one of these coming down the pipe. Maybe Sony's planning that, but with no Legend of Dragoon on here, because that's mind-boggling. So they have to be saving it for a second one, maybe as a selling point. Just, I don't understand. It's a Sony-owned thing. Why is it not on here? But yeah, Sony, you gotta sell the first one before you can plan a second one. And then Ridge Racer Type 4, and a lot of people were saying that they would prefer Gran Turismo 1 or 2 on here. I actually prefer Ridge Racer Type 4, so I'm happy about that. To Gran Turismo, those are great games, but I just prefer this overall. Give or take, I could leave or take Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. It's a fun little puzzle game. It's something fairly interesting and different, but as decent as it is, whatever. It's cool to have another puzzle game on here, and something that's pretty different and has an interesting take, but yeah, not one that's a favorite of mine. Same thing here, Syphon Filter. I think people forget how popular this was when it first came out, because I saw a lot of people like, why is this on there? Not necessarily my type of game, but I knew at least a dozen people that owned it, just as far as like close friends, and played the heck out of this thing. This was a really big hit, a bestseller on the PS1. So it was pretty huge in many ways. And of course, Tekken 3, I think that Final Fantasy VII, Tekken 3, and Metal Gear Solid are the three that are on here that of course were announced initially, that really are the biggest hitters and the most sort of essential, like the most number of people. When you think of the PlayStation, those three titles will come up in most people's minds, even if they're not fans of them individually. They are ones that people think of, Tekken 3, and again, I said this is the one that more than any other I noticed a little bit of the performance issues, but you know, I'm not expecting my cute little plug and play to replace my actual versions anytime soon, so it didn't really bother me. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, this is the only one on here that I have not had any experience with in the past whatsoever. You know, not even, you know, some of them I just played 5-10 minutes at a friend's house, you know, back in the 90s. This I've never played in my life, have zero interest in, but I went ahead and played a bit of it, and it feels good for what it is, but again, it's not really, you know, I'm not into any of the Tom Clancy games or any of the Battlefield stuff in the future, or, you know, any of the Call of Duty, any of that kind of stuff. You know, first-person shooters, I tend to like either something like Half-Life or something with a more arcadey feel, like Unreal Tournament or Quake or Time Splitters, definitely. So this is not really up my alley, but I understand why it's there, and it's pretty popular, and you need some kind of like a shooter to really flesh out the audience, especially for a North American release. And then you have Twisted Metal, another one where this was a choice that I think could have been better, but at the same time, it's still Twisted Metal. Twisted Metal's still fun. I fully expected Twisted Metal 1 or 2 to be on here. I prefer 2. My favorite in the series is Black 2, and then maybe 1 or 3, probably 1 overall. But yeah, this is another one that I expected one of the entries. I wish it was 2, but 1 is still fun, and it's still, you know, a really great car combat game to this day. And then we move on to the last one here, Wild Arms, which was one of the first RPGs on the system. I think Arc the Lad beat it in Japan, and I think Beyond the Beyond beat it here in North America. But yeah, this was mind-blowing back in the day. I was not expecting when I first put this in, or that intro is one of my favorite intros for games ever, because the sort of Wild West vibe mixed in with a very typical JRPG and then the fantasy elements. It was such an interesting combination I had not seen before. And eventually, I think after 1, 2, and 3, those are the ones I really like in the series. I think 4 and 5 moved away from that a little bit, didn't like those as much, but yeah, to me this is an absolute RPG classic and an early RPG on the PlayStation, one of my favorite RPGs on the system. So yeah, overall, again, there are some of these that I really, really enjoy and have a lot of personal attachment to. There are a handful of games on here, you know, Final Fantasy, Wild Arms, Tekken 3, that are actually in my top 200 games ever. But they are slightly inferior versions, but I expected them to be, so I'm not really disappointed. Overall, I'm very happy with my purchase because it met the expectations that I had going into it, and I think that a lot of the discontentment with it is that people, you know, had expectations that were beyond what this thing was probably going to be. I think unrealistic expectations, and also because I think there was an assumption that Sony was and could have, but was going to put more effort into this, and I didn't expect them to, really. So that's why I wasn't let down with a lot of the issues with it, because I really didn't expect this to be this perfect legacy thing. I expected it to be, again, just a cool little plug and play, a cute little miniature original PlayStation with a handful of games that I'm going to plug in every once in a while and play a game, but it's not going to replace the actual stuff. So I actually kind of hope that, you know, depending on what sales are, it could affect this, but I actually do hope a second one of these does come out, because I think with the backlash, and if sales don't meet expectations, that maybe, just maybe, that will force them to try a little bit more with obtaining rights to other games. I think that there's a possibility. It could also mean that they just aren't going to do one at all, and this is the end of it, and it's a, you know, failed experiment. You never know, but if it goes the other direction, we do get a second one. I do think that all the criticism could lead to a little more effort in the expectation of better sales, and I really hope to see stuff like The Legend of Dragoon on here. I really, really hope they get a little more effort from Square. I mean, Japan got Parasite Eve on theirs, but I would love to see that, or, you know, Bushido Blade 1 and 2. and maybe some sleeper hits like Klonoa, which wasn't a huge hit at the time, but is one of the best platformers in my opinion of that generation and is really respected now. And then maybe Legend of the Gaia, that'll be amazing, but we will see. I actually would like to see a second one of these. Definitely better though, if a second one of these does come out and it is the same just kind of okay performance and library as this, I probably wouldn't even get it, because one time, sure, but I already have my cute little mini PlayStation that plays a handful of games. I'm not going to want a second one unless it has something really killer on it. So I really hope that this is either just an odd footnote or Sony learns their lesson and actually puts in some real effort to get these out there. But again, I think I'm probably in the minority as far as being happy with my purchase here, but at the same time, I'm also in the minority of, my expectations were low enough that it met those expectations.